in the chat. We pay attention to those things, like to get you what you're interested in. And with that, I want to introduce our instructor tonight. So Sandy Letzing has a master's degree in resource management from Oregon State University and has extensive experience working with tribal, state, federal agencies to enact natural resource landscape scale projects. Her focus has been on forest health and wildfire resilience, as well as water quality initiatives in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. She is the Pacific Northwest Forester for Forest Carbon and works and is based in Carlton, Oregon. So I will stop my share and let Sandy share her screen and get going for us. There's a lot of curiosity about this topic. We're all looking forward to it.
Yeah, awesome. It's quite a mouthful. Maybe I should pare that down, I'm realizing.
I just had marbles in my own mouth, I think.
So before you meet yourself, can everybody hear me okay and see this okay?
Yep, looks good. Okay, so I'm just going to bow out here and put myself on mute. And you can take it away. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks for having me tonight, everyone. I'm a big fan of extension services myself. I'm a master gardener and I'm a property owner. So I find myself often at these talks trying to figure out what's going on with my well and with weeds in my garden. So I really appreciate and enjoy the extension services. So thanks again for having me. So again, my name is Sandy and I am the Pacific Northwest Forester for Forest Carbon Works. And I kind of want to go over my role today at Forest Carbon Works in helping the smallest forest landowners in the nation develop carbon sequestration and storage projects in their forests. I'll go over some of the other carbon development services, but as of right now, we are the only one that is working with such small landowners and in the Northwest. So previous to my current job, I was actually a stewardship forester for a conservation district in central Washington. And actually that's how I heard about Forest Carbon Works. It was the only company that I could connect small landowners to the carbon market. And I'm still excited to connect landowners to this new tool for them to use and also help them continue with forest health management practices and overall land stewardship practices. And of course, as Rachel mentioned, I'm an OSU grad, so go Bees. So Forest Carbon Works is a public benefit company, and we work to support small landowners providing full project development services for carbon offset projects. So we work to distill the really complex processes that are required for developing a carbon project into a simple membership service, and which allows access for all landowners of all sizes. So we currently have the smallest registered carbon project in the nation in Oregon, and that's 120 acres. And we are working to verify a 52-acre project this fall, also in Oregon. So we love forests, we like working with landowners, and we love giving landowners the tools to manage their land in really ecologically friendly ways, while also addressing our changing climate. So we're going to talk about carbon today in the context of climate change, and then the opportunities that we have in the Northwest, particularly for these carbon projects, some of the basics of the market and how it works, some of the barriers that small landowners face in entering the market, and then how FCW can help with that and entering into the market. I'm going to try to leave a lot of time for questions, as I know sometimes that's the best way to get to know an organization and how a project or program works. So real quick, and what does climate change look like now? And I think we all know how it can impact everyone. We have the winds in 2020 that started the wildfires in Oregon, prolonged droughts, the heat dome from this last summer, flooding in Germany. So you may have heard or read about the latest IPCC report on the state of our climate, and you know that the COP26 is happening, and they're trying to figure out what the next steps are. And again, I think we've all experienced now what that looks like in terms of climate in the Northwest. Particularly, I mean, just with that heat dome this summer, you know, the Boot Lake fire, I would say, was partially attributed to the drought, and that actually burned through two of our projects. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the red line is our worst case scenario, business as usual. The green line represents a really safe choice for us and our children, and this can only be achieved through very significant emissions and reductions. So how do we do that? Well, as private citizens, we can change the way we travel. We can buy hybrids, electric cars, change out our light bulbs, change our diet. But as a forester and a forestry company, we would argue, and the science now shows, that the biggest impact that we can have in terms of natural climate solutions is that if we can get private forest landowners into the carbon market, that we will have by far the biggest and most profound impact to our climate. This came out a little blurry, so my apologies, but you can see the top three categories here are all forestry. So reforestation, natural forest management, and then avoided forest conversion. So studies show that carbon storage in the US using only forest can be nearly doubled with the right actions. And again, these are keeping forests as forests, so avoiding conversion to non-forest uses, reforest or plant more trees and do forested or understocked areas. And then finally, and what we'll talk about mostly about tonight, is improved forest management or natural forest management of existing forests. These are the three types of forestry projects that are currently available for carbon credits in the US, and this is the focus of our talk today. The most common carbon project is, again, that improved forest management, as it works really well with working forests and family forest. So that's what we'll be focusing on. So the carbon market that we participate in, and the only regulatory market in the United States, is based in California. So the California Global Warming Act was passed in 2006. The idea was to return to pre-1990 emissions by 2020. And they did this by setting a cap on total emissions in the state, and then enforcing a 2% decline in emissions every year on the biggest polluters. So to help achieve those goals, the California cap and trade market was created, and it went live in 2012. So within that, market companies could buy up to 4% of their total emissions caps for the year. So those were in the form of offset credits. These offset credits can be purchased from the credits that are created by certified carbon storing projects. So, and at FCW, we certify forestry carbon offset projects. So for example, say that a steel mill has to reduce its emissions to meet that cap within California, which is a great idea because steel, is one of the biggest producers of greenhouse gas emissions. But the problem is in reducing that and trying to meet that 2% cap per year, they might have some financing or infrastructure issues that need to fall into place in order to install, zero emissions hardware or technology. So it's going to take them a little bit longer than a year. So the steel mill, in theory, could start mitigating its emissions by buying offsets in order to help them meet that goal. So again, they can only buy up to 4% of the necessary 100% to meet the cap goal. So the other 96 needs to be met with physical reduction in emissions. So Forest Carbon Works participates within this compliance market. Within that market, it's regulated by law. There are really strict requirements on the type of projects allowed, and there's really a rigorous certification of credits. There's methodologies that have to be approved for analyzing the amounts of carbon stored within your forestry projects, and 3 parties must verify them and the amount of credits that the project creates. In the end, however, the offsets or the credits tend to be worth more because of this than what you might find in the voluntary market. So the compliance market is also built around that idea of permanence. So this is something that we'll probably have to talk a lot about tonight as well, but all projects within the compliance market must last 100+ years. So with the goal of locking up the carbon out of our atmosphere for that length of time in order to make an actual difference in our climate. So this is versus the voluntary market. You may have heard a lot about this. It's because it's very popular with large companies. So Amazon, Microsoft, Pepsi, many airlines are all pledging to go climate neutral, and many of them are using the voluntary market to do so. This market is not regulated by law. Therefore, there is less rigorous certification for the credits. Projects can be as short as 1 year, but they average about 20 to 40 year. And so the impact that you would have on the climate tends to be much less than within the compliance market. So again, out of this cap and trade market is this new tool to offer landowners. And while the market is in California, these carbon credit offsets projects can be produced anywhere in the nation. So what you have is this credit money flowing actually out of California into the rest of the United States. So again, these credits are generated from the California cap and trade market. Companies in California are required to lower their emissions every year to meet this cap. And again, part of that cap is up to 4% of those emissions can be bought in the form of offsets. So just another example, because sometimes you'll find this kind of confusing. So if some company is putting out 200 tons of CO2 and they are required by law to reduce it by 100 tons, they may buy 4 tons of credits in the form of offsets that will go towards a forestry or another type of offset project. The other 96 tons have to be physically reduced, either by improving efficiencies, upgrading technology, and then the following year, the company has to reduce the emissions another 2%. So it's the step down goal. So this helps us step down emissions and meet these greenhouse gas emission goals. So now if the landowner is interested in growing their forest and sequestering that carbon in their forest, they can be paid to do so through these credits if they can get their project certified. So right now, 1 credit is 1 metric ton of CO2. And I think I checked today and that's worth about $14.90. So here in the Northwest, I would say we average between 90 to 130 tons of carbon per acre. So in the US, we're really lucky to have these really incredibly productive landscapes. About 1/3 of the US is covered in forests. Many of these are really highly productive forests. Families and individuals combined own 39% of forested land in the US. So within the US, America's forests sequester about 900 million tons of carbon a year, which is roughly 16% of US annual emissions. So the potential for carbon storage is particularly high in the Northeast. You can see that by the blue coloring, parts of the Southeast, and then of course the Pacific Northwest. Again, you can see that by the blue, where we have these really wet, mild conditions that allow for the quick growth of large trees. However, traditionally, part of the problem is that landowners with less than 5,000 acres have really been prohibited from participating in the carbon offset market due to high project development costs and complicated and confusing marketplace that is difficult to enter and to navigate. So it's really hard to tap into that 40% of private land in the US. So this graph shows the mean annual carbon sequestration in forests from between 2010 and 2017. On the far left, you can see the total CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. So that's on the far left, sorry. And so that's the uptake, sequestration with forests. And then you can see over right here is the 2016 CO2 emissions by fossil fuels. And on the far right, you can see the sequestration as a percent of CO2 emissions. And this is for the 11 continuous Western states in the US. So again, you can see that the Pacific Northwest has tremendous potential to sequester carbon, and much of that, again, can be found in private forest land. So small landowners own about 20 million acres in Washington, or about 15% of forested acres. In Oregon, that's 34% and about 10 million acres. So you can see that Oregon has the highest amount of sequestered carbon of any US state, even though it doesn't show the rest of the states, it's the highest in the nation, with about 34 million metric tons of CO2 sequestered per year. And that accounts for about 90% of the carbon that was emitted in the state from burning fossil fuels. So again, there's tremendous potential here, especially when you consider that about 76% of clear-cut harvests in Oregon happen on private land. So there's that potential for carbon sequestration for sure in Oregon. So the ability to uptake carbon dioxide is just really one critical function of forest ecosystems, of course. Carbon seems to be a really effective umbrella for the other functions that we care about in this landscape. Intact forests provide flood resiliency, they regulate hydrology, they impact local temperature moderation, and intact and diverse forests particularly improve the health of fish and wildlife habitat and support biodiversity. We know that salmon really cannot survive without forest and a healthy riparian. So again, these forests are really important for watershed protection by regulating soil permeability, overland flow and erosion. Protecting water sources in the West, I think, is of particular importance as we enter into climate change impacts. Across the US, we national and private forests are the largest sources of our drinking water. So there was a 2016 study that OSU put out that found that the conversion of old growth forests and late successional forests to plantations reduced summer stream flow by an average of about 50%. So preserving these intact forests really provide a great benefit to watershed protection and clean water supply into our future. And there's also papers that show that that as you increase carbon in a forest, it correlates directly with an increase in these co-benefits that we get from the forest. Forest resilience and adaptive capacity really increases with increasing plant species richness and diversity. So that preserving or managing for a high carbon forest would actually provide an additional buffer against potential ecosystem transformation that will come and is here with climate change. Okay, so before we get into how these carbon projects work exactly, it's important to understand where carbon is stored in a forest. So what's important to take away from this slide is that carbon is found in multiple areas or pools in the forest. The amount of carbon present in each pool changes over time due to multiple factors like age, species, disturbance, and time. Carbon projects quantify or measure the amount of carbon stored in 3 of these pools: the live above ground, here in A, live below ground, and then in liquid pools over in C. So this is referred to as carbon storage. Carbon sequestration is the pulling of carbon out of the atmosphere and depositing it into these 3 different pools through photosynthetic processes. So in trees, you'll find about, on average, half the carbon stored above ground in the trunk, limbs, and leaves, and about half below ground in the roots, soil around the tree. So as forests age or develop, sequestration and storage changes depending on what stage of development a forest is at. So forests at a younger age, there tends to be a really high rate of photosynthesis and growth. There's really vigorous competition and growth rates. And here's where you find the maximum sequestration rate. So they're trying to grow and outcompete their neighbors at this point until they get old and large enough for the forest canopy to close and really slow the growth because of reduced light. So once that canopy closes, carbon is still sequestered, but at a slower rate. But what you'll find here is that older, more mature forests have a greater amount of carbon storage, i.e. more carbon is stored in the biomass, the roots, the deadwood pools. Forests at this point tend to transition to more structurally complex and multi-aged forests at this point. And this can help balance that sequestration and storage. So this can happen when you have gaps in the canopy open, which allows space and light in for regeneration. This can happen naturally, like in windfall or fire, or via mechanical thinning. This increases the growth and sequestration of both younger and older trees, increases structural complexity, which is really ideal for carbon storage in a forest. the example that I like to give about carbon storage and sequestration of forests is that older trees tend to have more mass. So even if sequestration rates are less, the overall carbon storage is higher. So for instance, if you had a bank account with $100 and it was earning 6 or 8%, you would still be earning less than a bank account with $1,000 earning 4%. And you can think about forests the same as this portfolio. You really want a diverse portfolio to earn the most carbon over time. So old stands, middle-aged stands, young stands. The vast majority of our forests, however, in Oregon and in the US are pretty young, and they continue to be cleared over and over or cleared for development. So a little background on the organization I work for. Forest Carbon Works is a public benefit company with a mission of people, profit, and the planet. So a public benefit company, or PBC, is a for-profit company with the mission to deliver a positive impact through its activities and support long-term conservation of forests in the US through small family forest owners. So we were developed as a company 5 years ago. Our focus is on smaller landowners for forest carbon projects, which is really significant, again, when you recognize that 40% of forest ownership in the US is comprised of small family forest owners. So about 66% of forest land in Washington is between 20 and 1,000 acres. And that's really the sweet spot for carbon projects for us with Forest Carbon Works. We haven't gone smaller, but we have gone larger. We have 4,000 acres projects as well. So that's really the area we're looking to work in. So how carbon projects work. So carbon projects are the quantified accrual of carbon in forest over time, measured in both carbon storage and carbon sequestration. So this determines the amount of carbon, forest carbon offsets or credits that can then be transacted on the carbon market. So using improved methodology, we can measure both the carbon stored and sequestered. So the projects that we work on at Forest Carbon Works, and the majority of forestry projects in the US are improved forest management category. This means that the forested area that makes up the project is storing more carbon than business as usual scenario or a baseline forest management scenario. And I'll explain that more in a minute, but this means that you can create an additionality, or you can grow more carbon and store it and sequester it as a result of the project than what would be there in the absence of the project. So you're doing more than business as usual for that area. The length of these projects is 125 to 175 years. The first 25 to 75 years is the payment period, where you're receiving annual payments for the amount of carbon you're growing, followed by a 100-year legacy or conservation period. So this image demonstrates kind of more in detail about how to improve forest management project works over the duration of a project timeline. The gray line shows the baseline, and this is determined from regional averages and the business as usual harvest that you'll find in your area. So you can see, harvest rotation cycles for an average area, let's say in Northwest Oregon. The green line on top shows the change in forest carbon stocking over time. It rises and falls, again, depicting harvest periodically, maybe perhaps for this carbon project. But this is a project where they might defer a few harvests or change their management of the forest. And then they're going to have carbon credits accrue, and you can see that by the teal. That shows the amount of what we call additionality that the project creates, which would translate then into the number of carbon offset credits that the project is generating over time. So you might be wondering what an improved forest management project would look like for a small woodland owner. Well, it's really compatible for multiple management schemes, silviculture schemes that may or may not include harvest. So this graph shows carbon storage achieved through different forest management regimes. So this could include the carbon stored in wood products, if that is part of that forest management plan. And I apologize, the coloring didn't turn out as well, but the carbon storage is the lighter color on top. So you can see here where you have clear cuts, this is the amount of carbon that they estimate would be translated into a harvested wood product versus no management, and you have no wood products up here. So part of the goals of a forest carbon storage project is to store carbon. And again, if you are above that baseline, then you're making credits. So it really is up to the forest owner to decide how they want to achieve that and what that looks like for them. So for some folks, you might want to max out carbon stocking, which looks like less management. So individual tree selection when you're harvesting on a really low intensity cycle, or perhaps no management at all. Although, you know, as a former forest health stewardship forester, that's not something I necessarily recommend out west anymore. It's hard to do unless you have an old growth or a restored forest. Otherwise, you tend to get really overstocked, you know, monoculture stands that are prone to pest, disease, and fire. So out west, it's hard to get away with that unless you restore your forest to more natural conditions. But you know, it's possible, and that's a whole nother lecture, I would say. Otherwise, best management practices for carbon storage are generally the same as best management practices for forest health and biodiversity. You want uneven age stands. You would shoot for longer entries, cutting cycles or rotations, low intensity harvest. And I'll note that these projects are all different based on location, history, stocking, etc. So that's a big part of my job at Forest Carbon Works is I have to look at each individual project, work with the landowner or their forester and kind of figure out a plan that works for if they want to be in a carbon project and harvest, or if they don't want to harvest, or what their goals are for the land. And it doesn't have to be any of this. It could be focused on habitat or recreation. But in general, it's just good to note that larger acreages definitely have more flexibility, especially if you're looking to harvest, because you have to, again, stay above that baseline carbon from business as usual. So again, credits generated from the compliance market are really considered to be high quality, high value for a few reasons. One is that permanence, once again, so it's a long-term commitment. This guarantees long-term forest conservation, associated sustainable forest management. This also supports those co-benefits I talked about that are associated with this long-term forest conservation, including water quality, wildlife habitat, recreation, even local work opportunities provided by these projects. And this puts value behind these credits. And then by law, these projects follow really rigorous methodologies, reporting and analysis. So this really adds to the integrity. So again, looking at, or I guess we haven't talked about this yet, but some of the typical barriers for small landowners. So typically, like I said, these projects have really been prohibitive to landowners owning less than really multiple thousands of acres up until a few years ago because of three main reasons. One, the cost of inventory. You know, it's similar in some ways to a timber inventory, but it's a little bit different. And these tend to be really time and cost intensive. If anyone's ever had a timber inventory, they know. So we've actually at Forest Carbon Works, we have a new smartphone app to help us complete these a little bit quicker, more effectively, so we can do it more affordably. The second one is project development. So it's really time and expertise intensive. That baseline modeling involves really complex methodology and specialized knowledge. So including the ability to project carbon modeling into the future. So we have a full-time staff that does that and is well-versed in this methodology. So it makes it a little bit more efficient for us to analyze these projects. And finally, the verification by a third-party auditor. It's very rigorous and it can be very expensive. It's also really confusing to navigate the carbon market and able to offer and sell these credits on the market. So since we do these projects often, we know how to navigate that verification process, and often we can bundle projects and regions and then ask reductions in costs based on bundling and spreading out some of these fixed costs over these projects. So if interested, we try to keep the process really easy for landowners and affordable. So you apply, enter in all your property information online. We send out a real technician to do that first initial carbon inventory. We use that free pilot inventory to then determine an offer. So basically the price of carbon credits per year to be offered to the landowner. If you choose to accept, then you join our FCW as a member, and we take care of the rest of the entire process to sell your credits and keep your project into the market for the lifetime of the project, and that's up to 175 years. So the average time right now from application to offer is about 9 to 12 months. There's a mandatory 6-month waiting period on the California market once you apply. So it's at least 6 to 9 months. So again, how we keep it accessible, these projects accessible to landowners, is that we can minimize costs. We have a standardized platform. I talked a little bit about the inventory development verification costs. So to the landowner, there's no major upfront costs or commitment required until you get the, that free carbon inventory. And again, there will be no out-of-pocket costs to the landowners. It's all built into the project as we develop it. And again, we're able to spread those fixed costs over multiple projects in a region. And again, removing that complexity, because it can be a really complex and confusing market to navigate. What happens is you're paid per acre per year in 6-year renewable contracts in concurrent terms over 25 to 75 years. So every 6 years, you get a new contract that you can review. And I'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute, but every 6 years, we take a look at the price of carbon, and we take a look at the amount of carbon grown on the property, and we re-offer a contract for the next 6 years of how much you'll make per acre per year. So we do all the reporting required to the state for you as well. So a lot of you are probably here because you're wondering, what are the requirements and responsibilities of the landowners? As of right now, again, like I mentioned, the smallest project we have 52. We're really shooting for 40 acres. It'll depend on where it is and the stocking and all that stuff. But so our minimum right now is 40 acres. It must be privately owned in the continuous US. You must enroll all of your forest land, and that depends on the amount of acreage. If you don't have very many acres, we ask you to enroll all of your forest land. The bigger it gets, the more flexible we can be with that requirement. You can't be legally prohibited from harvesting via a restrictive easement, and you must have ownership of your timber rights, because if you didn't have those things, then we wouldn't be able to prove additionality, right? Like, it wouldn't matter if we did this project or not, because you would be able to harvest timber or make changes to your timber anyway. And lastly, if you've been enrolled in another credited carbon program, it disqualifies you from enrollment. We work with you to remain in the forest tax program that you're in, if you are in one, and you can be in a tax program and also a forest tax program and also a carbon program at the same time. So really our sweet spot right now with folks is like 150 acres or so. That really tends to get us over that, the cost of development. And an important thing to remember again is that participation in other carbon programs at any point, because that's considered double dipping disqualifies you. So you have to think about who you want to, if you want to work with a different company, how long. Because even if you work with a different company, a voluntary carbon project, you can't enter into a different carbon project after that. So again, with the responsibilities, it is a 125-year commitment to conservation, your forests, and the climate. But we really pride ourselves on being, providing and building a personal relationship with each landowner to figure out what their plan is, to make sure it's a good long-term plan. We have regional foresters like myself to build forest management plans or stewardship plans that outline your forest goals within carbon projects, or to coordinate for future harvest. We prepare and manage all that reporting on your behalf. Yearly, this usually looks like a one-page survey where we say, like, how many board feet did you harvest, or how many cords of firewood did you harvest this year? And that way you can really continue to enjoy your forested land. while maintaining a carbon project. And what I tell people about the 125 years is, and because I've done easements before with folks, is, look, you own this land. What do you want? It's not really different than an easement in that sense. And in the sense of what do you want to see happen with your property in the next 125 years? I mean, if you are interested in developing it or having it be developed into housing development or Walmart or, something like that, then maybe this isn't the program for you. But if you're interested in seeing it remain as forest in some contexts, with some flexibility for adding like a family home on the property, then really this isn't much different than having the easement that outlines like your goals for the forested, your forest property. So, in the first year, it's just a quick graphic to show you the timeline from making an account to when it's registered. So the things you're, as a landowner, you're responsible for are in dark green. Make an account, application, the review takes a few days. We usually approve it in about a week. And then we go out and do that initial carbon inventory. We present you an offer with all the information about how the credits, the funds and the credits will, come to the landowner. And then that is up to you to make the decision to accept or reject that offer. From signing to credit issuance is about 6 months to 9 months. So during that time, we make the down payment during this time. And there's no upfront cost at that point. We begin project development. We do that third-party audit I talked about. We sell the credits through the state of California, and then at that point we can make the remainder of the first payment to the landowner, and then you enter into the 25-year payment period. So again, we go through 6-year renewable contracts for the 25-year term. It can be extended up to 75 years, and that's for the payment period. This phase 1 is that initial initiation, pilot inventory, verification, and then for the next 5 years, you're receiving these annual payments. At year 6, we'll sit down, we'll do another re-inventory of your property to see how much carbon was grown during that time. We look at the price of carbon at that time, which is expected to keep rising, and then we make you another offer for the next 6 years, and that locks in your payments for the next 6 years. And then same thing at the end of that 6 years, we'll re-inventory, take a look at price of carbon. So during that time, we're meeting with you to figure out, okay, in the next 5 years, 6 years, are we going to harvest? And we can build that into the project as well. So then we will know to issue less credits or to expect less credits during that time. So it's really not too much of an issue. Sorry, before I go on, and then at that 25 or 75 year time frame, whatever you elect to receive credits for, you enter into the monitoring period. And so people are really worried about like 100 years of monitoring. So, but this is really increased flexibility. So at this point, you've grown a certain amount of carbon. During the monitoring period, there's really little to no oversight by the state of California. They might check in once or twice by looking at aerials, but really just want to make sure you're not totally clear cutting the project. If you are, they're going to check in. Basically, they want you to keep your credits above that initial baseline for which it was sold. So that's the important part here, that's during the monitoring period. And so that's pretty easy period to go through. So we are currently working throughout the US with small woodland owners. My focus, and a lot of our focus is in the Pacific Northwest, but we are working in the Northeast. We have projects in the Mid-Atlantic as well. We have close to 2,000 landowners in the pipeline. We've completed about 70, actually after this summer, probably close to 150 pilot inventories. We have 10 projects underway in the Northwest. So our first project was on the Rain Cloud family tree farm in Oregon. So it was also the smallest to be developed in the US. So it was a 4th generation family forest owned by a former smoke jumper and now a retired Forest Service employee, John Steward. His annual payments are helping secure it for the future generations. So they have their carbon payments going into a trust. in order to pay land taxes on their property for his kids and grandkids. Our second project in Oregon was the Rowan family legacy. It was actually close to being liquidated for timber revenues, and the family filled out a project or application with us and actually decided to hold on to their property based on the revenues they were able to generate with carbon. So their revenues are allowing that family to continue to maintain and manage the forest in the way that they would prefer. So payments for viable projects start about $10 per acre per year. And these are annual payments, not total, up to at least $100 to $150 acre per year. Again, once you get to the $100 plus is really on the west side of Washington and Oregon and maybe Northern California. So of course, if you're on the east side or Central Oregon, Washington, you're going to have larger acreage to make up for less stalking on the property that you usually see. So yeah, and that variation price per acre depends on the forest type and stalking, which is usually tied to location. So some common questions I see is that are carbon projects compatible with state tax programs? Yes, for the most part they are. We work with you to make sure, and your county and the state to make sure that you can fulfill the requirements of both, meaning that you follow your forest management plan and you adapt as needed. So it's okay to be in a tax program and a carbon program. And it just, it's an individual case-by-case basis. So depends on the size of your property, again, past history and stuff, but that's something that I work with you as a forester on to make sure we can fulfill those. Am I able to participate in more than one carbon program? So no, your property will be ineligible if in another different carbon project as soon as you initiate a project on your property. That means even for really short-term carbon projects. So there's a new company called NCX that is promising carbon projects in as short as 1 year deferrals, which is kind of, I actually find it insulting because it doesn't make a difference for forest health or the climate, and it will make you ineligible to do any other projects on that same parcel. But if that's your goal, then that's something just to know. So this is a common one if there's a natural event like a fire, windstorm that impacts my forest. So once you lock in that 6-year contract with us and your credits are sold, there's a buffer or insurance pool that is built into that. And so California and Forest Carbon Risk anticipates, about 20% of these projects will be impacted by some climatic or natural disaster event or pest or disease per year. So what will happen is you will finish out your contract, so that's 6 years, at the rate that you signed up for. So you'll receive your annual payments just as you started out with. At the end of that 6-year period, we'll then reevaluate what happened on your property. It may be that you were able to continue. Maybe you had a pest pine beetle outbreak or something. And so you took out those trees, but there's still enough carbon, and maybe you just see a small reduction in your overall carbon credits that you receive. If it's something catastrophic, we had a couple projects that burned up in the bootleg fire. And at that point, you would receive the credits for those 6 years, and then you'd be released from the project overall. So, that's something that myself as a stewardship forester really takes to heart when I'm developing these projects, is that we want them to be resilient and to maintain really good forest health practices, so that your forest can be resilient to these types of natural disasters, and you're not inviting pests to come onto your property and for the sake of growing carbon. That's definitely not what we're trying to do. Yeah, that's what I have. Here's my contact on the bottom. I am based in Carlton, Oregon, but I serve all of the Pacific Northwest. I've lived in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and familiar with forestry in a lot of those places. So I'm always happy to come out and take a visit, take a phone call, talk to you about what's going on. So feel free to ping me with questions if you ever have any. And thank you again for having me, OSU Extension. I really appreciate it.
Can you hear me, Sandy?
Yeah.
You can?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. It looked like my controls are off. Can you see me? I can't see it. I had this, shoot.
No,
Is
I
it a
stopped
black screen and you can't see my video? Is that right?
no.
No. Okay. Well, I'm partially working here. Okay. Well, that was fascinating and really interesting. Something that was great. That was all new information to me. So I bet that a lot of people feel the same way. Let's see here. There are questions in the chat. Marcy, are your controls good? My controls are a little wonky here.
Yes.
Would
Would you like me to read the questions?
I think so. Yep.
Okay. Jeff asks, how does non-commercial thinning of forest health affect potential carbon credits?
Yeah, so it definitely depends on what your prescription is, and the size and stocking of your forest. When we do a carbon inventory, we're not counting anything under 5 inches in diameter. So if you're doing a pre-commercial thinning that includes anything under 5 inches, then it doesn't matter. So if you do a thinning with anything over 5 inches, it might impact the carbon stock in your forest. But again, that all depends on what's going on with your forest. If you're doing that to release other trees, you might see a temporary dip in carbon credits, and then you might see it rebound. So often I'll talk to people about their 5-year plan before we do an inventory to try to decide if we're going to cruise the property before the thinning or after the thinning. And again, that just depends on what you have going on with your property.
Okay. Jeff has a few questions. Okay, how are the 125-year commitments passed on if the land is sold?
Yeah, so it's similar to an easement. So it stays with the property. So whoever it goes to, the carbon project goes on to as well.
Okay. And what happens when trees die of natural mortality, especially Douglas firs? Can dead trees be cut for firewood or timber?
Yeah, absolutely. I was really hoping to make that point tonight, is that our top priority when we do these forest carbon projects is to promote forest health, because a healthy forest is storing and sequestering the most carbon. So if that means taking out trees that are dead, diseased, and dying, yes, absolutely. Do we like it to leave a few snags here and there for habitat? Absolutely. But again, it just depends on what you have going on in your forest, if it should be taken out or left.
Okay. Gabby asks, can properties zoned commercial forest use or other similar zoning be eligible for carbon credits?
Yeah, it all depends again on if there's a requirement on your property to harvest as part of that. So I would just have to take a look at what the requirements were specifically for that property. Even if they did have to harvest, we could usually build in a harvest into a carbon project at some point in time to keep them within that zoning that they need to be.
Okay. A question from John. At the end of each 6-year period, can the landowner opt to exit the program for instance, if the price is adjusted or another reason? And is there any penalty for doing so? Yeah.
So at the end of the 6-year period, if you are in a project with force, or if you are working with us, we are the project developer, and you could always choose to leave and work with a different carbon company at that point, or you can choose to do it yourself. I tell people a lot, actually, the heavy lifting is done during that initial first-year period where we're developing the project. After that, often you might be able to hire a forester to help you do the rest of the work and the reporting. However, you are in a contract with the state of California, so you cannot leave the project without paying back the credits. So if you choose to leave after 6 years, you'd have to pay back those credits. So you don't have to continue to work with my company, but you could do it on your own. But if you choose to leave the carbon project as a whole, then yes, you would have to reimburse the credits that you were given.
Okay, that's important information. Ken is asking, we're saying we convert a percentage of our management slash to biochar. Do you factor in this long-term carbon storage?
No, that's not a part of our calculations. We don't do soil calculations either. I think it's a cool practice. I love creating biochar myself. I've worked with several clients in the past to do biochar, but again, we're not counting slash. We're counting if we're counting wood, dead wood or down wood, it'd be anything over 5 inches. So oftentimes that doesn't include slash.
Okay, here's another related question from Sarah. How is baseline determined between various projects when historical practices can vary widely? For example, biochar versus open burning for forest slash.
Oh, actually, so I didn't hear quite the end of that question, but the beginning I heard was how are baseline averages determined between different areas?
Yes.
Yeah, so they take the FIA data, so the forest inventory data from and look at it regionally. So there are some differences, but they'll make a baseline for, like, for instance, Northwest Oregon, and kind of reevaluate what the optimal growing conditions are and what are the average harvest practices in that area based on some of the tax revenues from timber, to take a look at how on average how much board feed is being harvested in that area per year, to kind of get an idea about what average practices look like for an area.
Okay, David is asking for, as an example, on a site that's 100 acres in the Coast Range of Oregon, approximately what would the annual payments be for the 25-year option?
Yeah, so I think you saw hopefully the slide at the end of like the Rowan family property. I would say that would be, and again, I really hate to answer this because it gets people's hopes up or down until you see the property yourself. But definitely on the Coast Range, we have some of the highest payments that we have anywhere in the U.S. So that would be likely above $100 per acre. Again, depending on when's the last time it was harvested, if it was harvested within the last 20 to 30 years, that would really make a dent on the amount of carbon there. But if it was a reasonably stocked like successional forest, I would say $100 plus per acre per year for that 25-year period.
That's great. Okay, Jeff has another question. Does signing up for carbon sequestration credits prevent a conservation easement?
No. So the only time we run into that problem with that, and actually we often do an easement concurrently as we're developing a carbon project. But the problem we have with easements is if the easement is in place already and it restricts timber harvest on the property. So again, if there's anything on the property that restricts that timber harvest, we can't claim additionality for the carbon that wasn't going to be cut down or removed in the first place, if that makes sense.
Paul is asking for an unmanaged Western Oregon Douglas fir stand. Does it sequester more carbon if left unthinned, or does thinning, commercial or otherwise, increase sequestration?
So again, that's tough, right? To a certain point, depends on the age and the density of the stand, right? So young Douglas forest stands are going to be sequestering a ton of carbon as they're growing, right? But then Doug firs tend to slow down as they lose light as they age. And that's when you really need that mechanical thinning to kind of open up gaps and light to allow them to grow larger at that point. So hard to say, but does that kind of answer the question? I would encourage thinning, but it all depends on the stocking and stand type. I mean, again, I would have to put my eyes on it.
Okay. Now Jim has entered something that I think is a statement, not a question. He says, commercial forest use zoning in Oregon does not legally require the landowner to harvest. The landowner just has to maintain the option to harvest, as well as meet specific stocking standards under the Oregon Forest Practices Act.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Those standards are flexible in terms of species composition, much more recognition of hardwoods as a means to meet the stocking standard than perhaps 20 to 30 years ago.
Yeah.
You agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. And Gabby asks, would a property that has been recently harvested and replanted be eligible? For instance, 100 acres replanted a year ago.
Yeah, unfortunately, we usually don't look at properties until it's been about 10 years plus. Again, that size class, right? So we're not measuring trees that are under 5 inches of size, and then you're not going to be above that baseline normally. So if that's part of the property, then sometimes that can, if it's a large property and part of it was clear cut, we can take a look at the project as a whole and average out the carbon over the property to see if it's above the baseline. But if the entire property was clear cut and it's been less than 10 years, it's very unlikely that it would qualify.
Okay. Jeff wants to know if they can talk with someone at your company before paying the $75 application fee.
Oh yeah, absolutely, including myself. And then we have a couple of just membership advisors on staff to look at paperwork and talk about tax programs and stuff. So just send me an email and I can link you in with somebody.
Sandy, maybe you could, if you can hear me, maybe you can drop your email into the chat. I have this control problem on my end. I would do it for you otherwise.
Okay. And would riparian expansion or stream restoration be included in the management plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of, we follow all the rules for timber harvest of each state. So I know here in Oregon, we just had a change to some of our forest practice standards. But so we follow the buffer guidelines for streams. So if it's a fish bearing stream, we don't count the carbon within a certain amount of buffer of that stream based on the size and the class of the stream. So because that couldn't be harvested for timber anyway. So that's not counted towards carbon. However, I know that they are working on, I mentioned reforestation as a carbon project, and that's something that's still being built, but I know in the future they want to focus on riparian areas for planting trees for carbon projects.
Okay. Someone is asking that you please answer John's question again. I'm not sure if I can scroll all the way back to see what that was. Okay, well, let's move on. Let's see.
Whoever had that question could re-put that question in the chat, copy and paste it if they want.
Yeah, that would make it easier. What would a 40-acre, 200-year-old Oregon white oak forest pay, or is it eligible?
A white oak forest?
Yes.
I mean, all forest types are eligible. We work throughout the US. Again, it depends on the density and the stocking. Honestly, I'd have to look up what the baseline looks like for that type of forest. But it would be eligible. So what I always tell people is you could always go to the website, put in all your property information. We'll look it up, and that's before you pay the $75. I can look it up and let you know, yeah, that looks good or that doesn't look good. And then if it's borderline and you're still interested, you pay the $75 application fee. That's the only fee you'll ever pay. And we'll send someone out to do that initial carbon inventory. So what I always tell folks is, like, at the end of the day, you end up with the cheapest carbon and timber inventory of your life, even if the project doesn't work out. But yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know if I could answer that. Sorry, I'd have to look at what that would look like on paper.
Okay. How close are the values from NRCS soil productivity in terms of correlation with the carbon storage potential?
I am not sure I know how to answer that question. I'm not sure what that means. Are they saying, well, I don't know. Could you reread that question? Sorry.
Okay. How close are the values from NRCS soil productivity in terms of correlation with the carbon storage potential?
I assume you're referencing soil productivity in terms of tree health and vigor. And I don't have an answer for that. Sorry. I could look into it and let you know if you leave your email. But.
Okay. This is a long one. Okay, for easements, if there's a clear intent statement that the landowner is changing behavior for the purpose of increasing sequestration and storage above their business as usual, and the easement is a statement of that commitment to do so, and can they effectively keep their baseline lower, not to be penalized for entering the easement?
Mhm.
Can they keep their baseline lower?
I think
Yeah,
they're saying if in their easement, part of their easement wouldn't be that they were restricting harvest in some levels, so that then the easement wouldn't be kind of disqualifying them from carbon storage, if I understood that correctly.
Okay, yeah, if that's the case, yeah. And if you're developing an easement at the same time as entering a carbon project, we can help you word it correctly so that you can do both. But yeah, I just can't restrict overall timber harvest, even if that's, even if, the landowner knows that's the intent is not to timber harvest, it just can't say it in the easement. Hope that answers the question. I'm still not really sure.
Marcy, could I interject a question here?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
I was wondering, so you've got your kind of baseline, your average baselines based on a regional average.
Mhm.
What could you put some numbers on that? Like, is it like baseline is maybe a 30 to 40 harvest year interval, and now you shift it to a 70-year harvest interval or something like that?
It's an average of the basal area. So you're looking at the volume of trees in an area. So it doesn't necessarily, so we look at how much is being harvested, and you look at the optimal growth rates for trees, so you know what you can grow. But based on the amount of harvesting happening, what is the average? It's basically looking at the average basal area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what I meant was kind of getting at what does that look like in terms of a change in harvest practice, like in terms of time, or
yeah,
with that,
like
looking at that chart where you had the jagged line, you had the kind of beige jagged line, and then you had the increase, and then you still had maybe some harvesting going on.
Yeah.
Just in really rough numbers of what that might be
so
a change
in
in management practices.
Yeah, so in Western Oregon, if you're looking at 60 years, 40 to 60 years, again, it really depends on, property size and stocking type and stuff, because you couldn't, in general, you couldn't clear cut the entire carbon project, right? So you would have to, you'd have to break it up into either like individual tree removal, selective tree removal, or clear cut a smaller percentage of the property at a time, if that makes sense. So it stays above that baseline average. So maybe you are still going to harvest some at 60 years like you normally would, but you would harvest a smaller percentage. And then every year you would harvest 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%. Does that make sense? Instead of harvesting all at one time at 60 years, you might have to break it up into and it depends again on the size of the property. If you wanted to continue to clear cut, that would look like maybe 10% a year, or, selectively harvest 10% of the property every year for the next 20 years. So you'd end up really more at an 80-year rotational cycle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good example. That's the kind of thing I was after. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Marcy.
Okay, this is the question that someone had wanted you to answer again. At the end of each 6-year period, can the landowner opt to exit the program? And is there any penalty?
Yeah, so again, you can exit the program at any time. You just have to repay the credits that you're issued, unless there's like a catastrophic fire or something, and then you'd be released from the program. But it's the 6-year contracts are with Forest Carbon Works, the developer. And so at the end of that 6-year contract, you are choosing to leave working with us. However, you're still in a contract with the state of California for that 125-year or 175-year period. So if you leave the program overall, then you have to pay those carbon credits back. If you leave working with us, that's fine. You can find a new carbon developer, or you can do it yourself or with a forester, if that makes sense.
Okay. And then someone's asking to follow up on the slash management, given the propensity for fires. Do I understand that should additional carbon offset opportunities arise from specifically the treatment of slash, biofuel, or biochar, as examples, this would not be a factor in any contract with Forest Carbon Works?
No, I mean, as a stewardship forester, I would try to help advise the landowner or the forester that you work with on the best ways to dispose of slash, but we do not offer carbon credits for how people dispose of their slash. We do it for the amount of carbon stored and sequestered on your property.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. Are annual carbon payments indexed to some generally recognized carbon index? So as the market price of carbon goes up or down, do the payments to landowners?
So no, if you work with us as a carbon development company, what happens is we inventory your property, we present an offer, and then you sign that contract with us for 6 years. So at that point, you are locking in that price of carbon for the next 6 years. So the amount of carbon you have for your property and the price of carbon at that time. And we break it up into payments every year for 6 years. And so what that does is it takes on, so there's a chance that the price of carbon could go down, and that's would be, we're taking on that risk. There's also the chance that the price of carbon could go up during that 6 years. And so you as the landowner are taking on that risk. However, at the end of that 6-year contract period, what we do is we sit down, reevaluate the amount of carbon on your land, and then renegotiate the price based on the current price of carbon. So we are expecting the prices to go up. So every 6 years, you should see a significant increase. But no, within our company, we lock that price in right when we sign that contract. And then every 6 years, it's we take a look at both the price of carbon and the amount of carbon accrued on your property and re-sign a new contract.
Okay, that makes sense. NRCS has a mapping tool based on soil types and forest productivity. It gives a number which correlates to site index. So that's that was a comment, not a question.
Oh, okay.
Okay, have you helped anyone survey prospective carbon sequestration projects before a piece of land is purchased?
No, since we're kind of still new to the game, that's not something we've done. However, that is something I'm doing right now, and I think we'll do in the future with some landowners. Yeah, and actually we've had real estate agents reach out to us because people are looking specifically to buy a property that for a carbon project. But I am working with like a land trust right now, and part of buying the project is they want to put it into a carbon project, and so we're going to try to give them an idea of what that would look like. Normally we don't do that, but again, we always look at a case-by-case basis.
Someone's asking, what's the business model of carbon development companies? Does the state end up paying the company and the company takes a percentage? Are those percentage numbers public? Are the state programs available without going through a carbon development company?
Yeah, so as a development company, what we do is we do that initial carbon inventory, and then we present you an offer of what you can make per acre per year on the price of on the amount of carbon on your property. With that, you see all of the cost of project development that is taking out of that, that we take out of that for project development, the inventory, and verification. So to cover our cost when we sell those carbon credits. So that said, any personal private landowner can enter into the carbon market. They just have to know how to navigate that process. They have to know how to inventory for carbon. They have to model and analyze that carbon and jump through all the hoops to get it verified as a state project. And that can be, tens of thousands of dollars. When we do present an offer to a landowner, that's all very specifically laid out. So the landowner knows what's coming out of the project for our cost, and then what's going to end up with them.
Okay. And Jeff wants to know whether you're able to even say this. What are the closest competitors to FCW that serve small landowners?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, I forgot, I honestly was going to mention that, and there's a chart I can email out to folks because really it's pretty limited right now. So Finite Carbon, but they do voluntary projects. So again, they are doing 20 to 40 year projects. And then their price of carbon for their projects is like $4 to $8. So the problem with that is that you have to have larger and larger land size to make a project viable at that point, right? Because you can't get that small acreage and still make a project worth it. The Nature Conservancy is developing a carbon program. It's called the Family Forest Program. Right now, they're still within the voluntary market, and they're only on the East Coast. And then NCX, which is a Microsoft backed carbon, and they're the ones that are doing the 1-year deferrals, which you know, I honestly thought was kind of insulting. It doesn't actually do anything for the climate. And so again, they're voluntary. So the problem there is that you still have that issue with not generating enough income to overcome the cost of project development for smaller landowners. So you're gonna end up working with larger landowners. So those are the three major ones. But yeah, feel free to Google, and I'm also, I can share that graph with you with the, at the end, I can email it out of the other carbon companies.
Great. Well, that's the last question that has been posted on our chat. Thank you so much, Sandy. We really appreciate it. Rachel, do you have any other questions or things to add?
No, yeah, that was fascinating. I think we all really appreciate it. It was a great introduction for a lot of folks here, a lot of really good questions in the chat. And I'm sorry that I'm kind of locked out. We'll have to look at that for future, what's going on here. But yeah, we'll share this recording with folks who registered for the class. And if you want to share that chart or anything, I can share that in the email afterwards for folks.
There's a final question posted by Sarah. When you said that owners must enroll all forested ownerships, does that mean if you have 650 acres, it must all be included in the program?
Not necessarily. So again, as you get into larger acreage, we're able to leave out forested acreage sometimes based on the size of the project. So again, we're just trying to get over that hurdle of making sure that we can pay for all these development costs. And then after that, we can kind of, be more flexible. So really, at 40 acres, that's not looking good. We really need up to about 100 plus, but at 650, sure, just shoot me an email or, let us know what you're looking to do, and we can be flexible.
Great. Okay. Well, this is really interesting information. We appreciate it very much.
No, thanks again for having me. I love OSU and OSU Extension. So again, feel free to reach out to me or visit our website. It's forestcarbonworks.com, and happy to help you guys start the carbon journey.
All right. Thanks so much, Sandy.
All right. Take care.
Okay, Marcy, I'm just gonna, if you're ready, I'll just end the meeting if I can here, which I think I can. Can you stop the recording?
Sure.